EU Antitrust Chief Margrethe Vestager announcing she will now meet with chief execs from key tech giants next week, including leaders from Apple, Nvidia, Alphabet and Broadcom. For more on this, we turn to Ryan Heath, Axios Global Tech Correspondent. Thank you for joining us this morning, Ryan. So we know that the EU has really been taking the lead here on framing an AI framework here. What are the expectations for this trip?
Well, it's a double-hatted trip, actually. So yes, the EU has locked down its new AI Act, but the big thing there is it's actually not going to be in force for another year for the first half, and the second half, it's going to be 2 years before they start implementing it. But the way regulators work, obviously, is playing catch-up to markets a lot of the time. So the previous big piece of legislation, which is about trying to limit the power of big tech gatekeepers, that's really coming into force from March this year. So Vestager is going to be here previewing the AI Act, but also a little bit reading the Riot Act about this digital markets legislation, which is really trying to make sure that the big companies run open ecosystems. They don't try and lock you into their app stores. They don't preference their own systems. So she's going to go around these companies one by one and work through how they're going to relate on this legislation together.
And Ryan, how do you think this is going to be received? Because if they're really being perceived as gatekeepers here, but they also want to be really at the forefront of some of the legislation as well, how do you balance that?
Yeah, it's really tricky. So the companies have a very different attitude to 10 or 20 years ago, and some of them are very new too. So they've only ever known this very aggressive European Union. But I think the Googles of the world, the Metas, the Apples, they've come to realize the EU isn't going away. They don't particularly like the way the EU approaches regulation, but they know that it's a very lucrative market and it makes more sense to play ball with them at some level. So there's this constant tension between how do they give a little bit to the EU, look cooperative, but at the same time, don't do anything to cannibalize their business. And that's the constant back and forth between the companies and people like Vestager. And she's back in the hot seat now because she was running for a new position to be head of the European Investment Bank, and she lost out. So now she's coming back with her tail a little bit between her legs, and she's got 1 year left to secure her legacy and make a difference. So you might see a slightly fine-tuned Vestager in these meetings as well.
So are we expecting her to really try and make her mark here, or really try and do what it takes to really get some results here, as you said, because the legislation isn't supposed to kick in for another year?
Yeah, I think she's really got to try and secure some results. She's a pragmatist at the end of the day. She sets sort of fairly radical and ambitious goals, and then she sort of puts her head down and tries to find pragmatic ways to get some of the way there. And now she's really into that tail end of her time in Brussels, and she's had a few defeats in big court cases over the past 12 and 18 months. So it's really time to show some results. It's not enough to just wave a piece of legislation around. She's got to actually make a difference in how these companies operate, in how the market itself is structured. And so I think there's going to be a lot of that pragmatism on show during this visit.
And Ryan, we know that there's been a lot of antitrust push here for some of these big mergers and acquisitions here, and really the pace of innovation not keeping pace with regulation in the US. Some saying perhaps the US might follow the EU's lead, but in terms of actual progress made on either side here, who's really leading the way?
Yeah, it's more like everyone is driving around a roundabout at the moment. It's not that nothing is happening, but the US system has been, under the Biden administration at least, really taking a leaf out of the EU's book on antitrust, but they haven't been able to update any of their laws. Like you see very aggressive regulators at the FTC, like Lina Khan. You see very active conference circuits where people do come up with new ideas. They do try and find ways to apply this EU approach to antitrust, but we're not seeing a lot of successful court cases. We haven't seen a big new piece of legislation come out of Washington. So there's a lot of activity, but not a lot of progress on the US side. And then, of course, US antitrust always has the courts involved, unlike the EU system, where the courts are much less involved. And then when you sort of like move to the parallel game of how is AI going to be regulated, because there is such gridlock in Washington, you're going to start to see the courts get really involved in issues like copyright in the course of 2024. You have big lawsuits from companies like the New York Times. You have other creators who are basically saying OpenAI and these other big AI companies have literally just stolen their content and are now making money out of it. And because you're not getting the legislation out of Washington, you're going to have to get some kind of resolution through the courts. So there is going to be action on a lot of fronts over the next few months.
Certainly may be a case of regulation by legislation, or the other way around there, as we're seeing really a lot of these state-by-state actions here, as we're really waiting for some sort of action out of Congress. Appreciate you breaking that down for us. Ryan Heath, Axios Global Tech Correspondent, thank you so much.
Thank you.